it's Alabama Annie with another episode of Stories and Songs for you. As I've told you before, I like to go through old newspaper articles and magazine articles, and I find some interesting stories for news of the odd and unusual. And today you're going to hear one about a lady who bought some land at auction from the U.S. Army. And here we go. It's called Exploding Chickens in Aunt Jane's Barnyard. Can you imagine that? After World War II, Aunt Jane found herself a widow at the age of 74 and decided she wanted to leave the little house in town that she and her husband had bought as newlyweds and move to the country. It had been both their dreams to raise chickens and goats for the fresh eggs and milk, and to have a little garden where they could grow their own vegetables. But after Bob had taken ill suddenly, they never got the chance together, and Aunt Jane spent 2 years caring for him before he passed away one cold winter night. But before he left her, he made her promise that she would take the insurance money and buy that farm they'd talked about and raise those goats and chickens, and she told him that she would. A few months after Bob had been laid to rest, Aunt Jane climbed into their old pickup truck and drove the last of their belongings out of town into the countryside to a small farm she had purchased and set up housekeeping. She had bought the beautiful little place at auction after the U.S. Army had sold off sections of an old training base that was no longer in use. Since World War I, the base had been used for training, and the house and the small farm had been home to 6 cavalry horses and their caretaker. After Aunt Jane had her little house in order, she had a local carpenter to come and build her a chicken yard and house, and then traveled to a nearby farm where she bought herself 3 goats, 6 chickens, and a rooster. Soon the dream she and Bob had shared of having fresh eggs and milk was a reality for her, and that first spring she tilled the existing garden plot and planted tomatoes, squash, beans, greens, peppers, and lettuce. Things went along nicely that first year. The chickens were thriving and giving Aunt Jane a bounty of eggs. The garden stocked her pantry with canned goods, onions, and potatoes, and gave her fresh lettuce, fall greens, and turnips. And the goats gave her a gallon or more of milk each week. Aunt Jane was very happy and only wished her Bob could be there to enjoy it with her. In the spring, Aunt Jane decided to expand her chicken yard so that she could sell some eggs and give herself a little pocket money. She spent a week clearing the underbrush and weeds from a small plot adjoining the chicken yard, and had more fence posts set and strung new wire so that the yard was double the size it had been. She went off to buy 6 more hens and another rooster, and in no time had them home and settled in with the others, and her hens were happy, the roosters were crowing, and they were laying eggs. Not the rooster, the chickens. Then one morning, while she was feeding the hens, she was gathering eggs from their hutch, she heard a loud bang that sounded like a shotgun blast. It startled her, it was so close. It caused her to jump and bump her head on the hutch door, and she kept low, thinking some hunter had taken a wild shot. Just as she was about to shout a warning, another bang came. She turned and looked across the chicken yard and saw one of her hens blown to smithereens and another nearby. Both hens exploded in a burst of feathers and fell to the ground. Huh. "You're shooting my chickens," she cried, scanning the woodline for anyone, but she didn't see a thing. As she carefully moved away from the hutch toward the dead hens, while the healthy ones pecked the ground around her, one of her favorites, a little red she'd named Betty, exploded before her very eyes, sending a tuft of feathers and flesh into the air, and before she could comprehend what she had just seen, 3 more of them exploded again. She raced to the gate, grabbing up 4 of the hens as she went, trying to save them, tossing them onto the lawn, and went back for more until she had rescued 7 of them and 1 rooster, shoving them into the garden hut. Outside the chicken yard, she could only watch in dismay as the remaining rooster and 2 more hens went boom. What on earth was going on? What could cause chickens to explode? She had to have answers, and fast. She ran inside her house and called the farmer she had bought the chickens from, and he came over straight away, puzzled himself until he saw where she had expanded the chicken yard. He walked through the gate of the enclosure and knelt down, finding what he was looking for in just a few moments, and held up a piece of carbide in his hand for Aunt Jane to see. "This is your problem right here," he said. "Well, this and that black stuff you see in the soil, that's gunpowder," he exclaimed, as Aunt Jane listened in disbelief. "This farm here was owned by the Army, as you know, and you remember that, don't you? Well, this piece of ground where you built your chicken pen is where the munitions house stood. It's like a powder keg out here. If a chicken happens to come up on some gunpowder and pick that up, or a chunk of carbide while they're pecking around and they eat it, well, boom," he exclaimed, throwing his hands into the air. Aunt Jane looked from him to the dead chickens. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, as one last chicken exploded right in front of them in a burst of feathers. Aunt Jane had her chicken yard moved to the other side of the house after that, and she had no more exploding chickens, and finally carved out a niche in the little fresh egg market for herself. The sign at the produce stand where she sold them read, "Exploding with flavor." Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it was brief, but I'll be back with more. So carry on and have a great day.